Everything we do online leaves a digital trace. Social media, streaming, shopping, messaging. Companies track what you do even outside their platforms. And while some of your personal data may be used to improve or personalize a service or contribute to research from AI to biotech, a profit incentive is often lurking in the background. So, how do we win back the right to decide who uses our personal data and how it's used? Well, to discuss some of the possible solutions, we welcome back Max Schrems, an Austrian lawyer, privacy activist, and the founder of the European Center for Digital Rights, aka NOIB, speaking to us from Vienna. And in Taipei, we have Chou Kuan-Ju, Deputy Secretary General of the Taiwan Association for Human Rights. Max, unlike the three of us here, younger generations are now growing up in a fully digital environment and probably interact with it in very different ways compared to us. Your organization, NOIB, has recently won a case against Microsoft concerning how the company was gathering children's data through their educational software. What concerns you the most about how big tech companies collect children's data sort of through the lens of this case and in general, and why is that such a big problem? What could be the long-term consequences of that?
Yeah, we generally have a policy that these fundamental rights apply to everybody and not just to children. And to a certain extent, a lot of teenagers are probably even more aware of what they're doing than a lot of elderly people being on an app. So I always have a bit of a nuanced approach to the age issue. I think why the Microsoft in Schools case, and we have similar cases in Europe on like Google and so on, is especially interesting is because you couldn't choose it. Like basically you have to use that service because your school requires you to do so, and otherwise you can simply not participate in education anymore. So that makes it quite interesting. The other thing that made it interesting is the role of the Austrian government in this case. So basically we would expect the governments in Europe to actually follow the laws, do proper, approval of these software services, that they actually do what they're meant to do. And in the procedure, it became quite obvious that no one at the government has actually checked what Microsoft is doing with this data. The government shifted the responsibility to the local school. Then we had the headmaster of the local school here that basically said, I'm one headmaster and one assistant person. How am I going to control Microsoft now? So a lot of that, once you drill into these cases for 1 and 2 millimeters, you quickly see that there is some, paperwork compliance that on paper looks somehow fancy with like some privacy policy. But just if you like poke a little bit, you realize how all of that collapses quite quickly. And that shows quite well on what we've just heard as well, is that we have laws in theory and on paper, but not really enforced. And that's quite interesting for the digital age in general, is a lot of the judges, a lot of the authorities, a lot of the politicians still see digital rights as a abstract thing that probably concerns some weird people, when in reality by now it concerns most of our society. And we are still baffled by that in Europe as well, to see, okay, if you have a claim of €5, you can go to court and you will get a judgment on these €5, even though that may not be the biggest case. But once you actually want to have your fundamental right to privacy protected, which for many people in individual cases is worth much more than €5 if, very sensitive data, for example, is online, then suddenly all the courts are like, it's some digital thing, something with computers, let's not deal with it. And the same thing is true for the regulators. We officially have politically independent regulators in Europe. But the reality is that national governments appoint people to these regulatory positions that are not going to bother business. And again, especially at these couple of jurisdictions, which is typically Ireland, sometimes Luxembourg, where there is a larger policy of non-enforcement of EU law that goes beyond privacy alone. It's also that they don't pay taxes or anything there. So that is a bit the problem that we're having, that we still need more awareness that this is a real thing, not just on paper, but also then in the actual enforcement of the law. And the enforcement is, after all, the executive branch and the judicial branch, where largely we see that if you really come up with a case, they try to find some reason not to deal with it. To give you a precise number, in Europe, we have about 1% of all complaints that ever lead to a fine. So in all of Austria, we had, I think, 55 fines 2 years ago when we had the numbers the last time. for the whole country in GDPR violations. And to compare that, just the city of Vienna had fines for 7,000 wrongly parked e-scooters in 1 month. So e-scooters is something we definitely take seriously, it seems. Digital rights, not so much. And that is quite baffling if we move into this digital age, obviously.
Well, Guanru, we know that training large language models, systems that are popularly known as AI, requires vast amounts of data, and some companies take it without asking, while others are a little more careful, or at least give users the option to opt out. Now, for the end user, do you think that it makes any difference whether their data is being sold to advertisers or used to train a large language model? To play the devil's advocate, maybe it's not so bad to have one's voice represented in this corpus that leads to a new model being trained.
I think in these questions, there are many different aspects because in Taiwan currently that I think many governments and academics are discussing about the artificial intelligence sovereignty, but it is under the context about that, talking about the language that in Taiwan we are using. They are emphasizing the Mandarin we are using are different with other countries, and in Taiwan we have our own culture and own context of living. But I think the most foundation question is that how can people in Taiwan own the autonomy in this kind of technical development? I think these questions become more complex when dealing with artificial intelligence because it seldom discussing about consent rights. But I think I do not have a direct answer discussing about the training on artificial intelligence model. But maybe we can look back to other cases that what Taiwanese government do to boost the scientific research on using the health data, because in Taiwan that back in 2022 that we have a constitutional case, and we finally got a constitutional judgment. And this case is about that Taiwanese government are using the national health insurance data that have the whole population of Taiwanese and also people who pass away, to use this kind of data without data subjects' consent, and also refuse to let people exercise their opt-out rights, and use this data on academic research. And even in decades ago, that it only used this data on industry use. But currently, it is only academic research and other research that is dealing with statutory duties of other public sectors. But what I'm saying is that I think if that to speaking about what is good for the society and what civil society wants to get engaged in, the very important component is that how can data subject and also researchers get this mutual interactive relationship through this kind of trust. And I think sometimes this trust is built on the data subjects. They have the right. They need to get the consent and opt-out rights to know what their data are doing with in this research, even medical, no matter it is medical research or it is about AI model. Because as I know that back about the national health insurance data, there are some research is relating to the AI model that is relating to medical. So it is not a language model, but it is relating to medical image recognition, and also some certain disease risk assessment. So I think if this kind of research should have a more accurate and some further feedback about the patients, it should be has further interactive with subjects. So not to view subject as they are just numbers. So controllers, if they have some pseudonymized model and they think that they don't have to respect the data subject's consent or other rights or right to access. But I think this rights will help the research to become more full and complete and good for the people that they are wanted to help that using this kind of new technology. So although that I know there are some researchers or data controllers will view that the data autonomy advocacy is a burden to their research or business, but I think that this relationship helps the future research will have more good to all the people they are trying to help with their with their research.
Well, speaking of interactions between users or subjects and companies and models, Max, some jurisdictions, I'm thinking of the EU here, are instituting what's called the right to be forgotten, which is forcing companies to delete data they might have collected on an individual. But is it even feasible when it comes to AI training? I mean, your organization's recent case in Norway suggests that it really isn't.
Yeah, I mean, feasible is a question of who you ask. A lot of the companies basically just say all these laws are not feasible. I don't think that's accurate. I think what we need more is a bit of a staged approach here. So when it comes to AI training, for example, you basically can minimize most of that data because the average LLM, for example, doesn't really care about someone's individual information. They care about like larger trends. And that can go in sync with privacy. If you basically anonymize data first and then use it for training, you basically have a very low chance that that data ever surfaces again in the data set. Now, there can be outlier situations, and that situation in Norway is a wonderful example. For the viewers, maybe that was a guy where it was, he was named as a person with the city that he lives in. There is just no one else in that town that is called that way. And it was said he killed all his kids, I think was the case. We have more and more of these cases where just these AI systems are making up stuff. So these are cases where we then have to say, okay, these privacy rights that we do have in Europe, which, as you mentioned, there's the so-called right to be forgotten. It's just a right to be deletion. The European Union wanted to brand it with a nice wording. But basically, in these cases, you must have the right to say, actually, if this is inaccurate and you can reproduce it each time the question comes up of who is, for example, Max Schrems, and it says a child killer, then I should have the right to get that deleted also on an AI system. Now, the industry usually says, oh, that would require, fine-tuning of data, and that costs money, meaning a couple €1,000. But quite frankly, if you get the profits from AI, then you'll also have to invest into the compliance cost that comes with it. And the AI does generate exactly that problem that there is fuzzy data, unclear data. And it's quite interesting because a lot of the principles we have in European privacy law and quite frankly in global privacy law came up in the 80s when they saw, okay, at some point we're going to have a big algorithm that is going to suck up all the data of everybody, going to make weird decisions, and we're not going to be able to understand any of this anymore. Therefore, we need transparency, we need access rights, we need correction rights, we need deletion rights. that is exactly AI that they described. I mean, they described that stuff before I was born. It was kind of foreseeable. And it's kind of interesting that now we're at that point where this AI really exists. The industry says, oh, it's not feasible to comply with any of these laws. So that's a bit disingenuous. I sometimes joke it's a bit like if we would have come up with speed control or speed limits when there was still horse-drawn carriages, and now the first time we have actually a motor car, everybody's like, that's innovation. We couldn't have foreseen that we're going to go that fast, so we don't need speed limits anymore. That's kind of the argument we're having on AI. The truth probably lies in the middle, that we come up with a system where data gets cleaned, where data that is not of general relevance gets removed from the data set before training, and you just gradually risk it down that there's typically no such cases anymore. And if that one outlier case happens, yes, then you have your rights to kind of correct and delete it. That would be an approach that could get AI training plus privacy rights somehow in balance.
Well, we're almost out of time here, but I do want to raise one more issue. Well, Taiwan is preparing to launch what it's calling a Personal Data Protection Commission. And as Taiwan and other countries are setting up similar institutions and similar sets of rules for handling of personal data, how much should they look to laws like Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, that we've mentioned already, based on what has and hasn't worked? So this is a question for both of you. Let's start with Max real quick.
So generally, there is a framework in Europe that goes beyond Europe. A lot of South America, for example, follows the same principle. We roughly have about 70 to 100 countries, depending on how you frame it, that follow the European model. But I have to say that a lot of the European things, for example, were stolen from the US again. So a lot of that is more of a global model than a European one. One big benefit is that it usually comes with free data flow. So basically, the rule is if you're following the same set of rules, then data can travel freely between countries. Once there are different rules, there is a limitation of that. I think the one big learning of what Europe did not manage is proper enforcement of it all. And that is something where, for example, collective redress can play a factor. Claims in individual courts that are accessible can play a factor. So that is all the elements that I think Europe did not really manage well, is this enforcement side of it.
Kuan-Ju, what do you think? As Taiwan is building up its own data protections, private data protections, what should it draw from both in the EU and elsewhere in the world? What are some of the rules and enforcement methods that actually work?
I think that the government should value more about what makes the Data Protection Authority independent. And I think the independent is that what we can learn from EU and also the nearby countries in Asia. For example, like currently, that as I know that the Taiwanese government put the Data Protection Authority in a, we will call a second tier in the government level. But I think at least the Data Protection Authority should have the power and the resource that equal to those ministries that handle a massive scope of personal data, and also the ministry that does not have massive personal data, but has the power to launch data usage policy. So I think the current resource of the Data Protection Authority in Taiwan is not enough, and also about the resource and also the power, that I think the Data Protection Authority should have some procedure tool to let them be able to investigate and also to enforce the Data Protection Act.
Plenty of things on the agenda for the Taiwanese government as it is setting up its own data privacy systems. Thank you both for this very enlightening conversation. Chou Kuan-Ju joining us from Taipei, and Max Schrems speaking to us from Vienna.